In the previous lecture, we looked at de Saussure's analysis of phonemes and learned about the structuralist idea that things only are what they are because of the greater structure that they are part of. In this lecture, we will discuss Saussure's ideas about signs and meaning, and about the relation between language and the world. The ideas about identity from the previous lecture will turn out to play a very important role. Language, Saussure tells us, consists of signs. Signs always have two sides. They consist of a signifier, which is something that signifies, and a signified, which gets signified by the signifier. Take the word book again. If we consider the spoken word, then the signifier is a certain sound pattern, book. As we know from the previous lecture, this sound pattern has to be analyzed in terms of phonemes. But what does this sound book signify? What is the signified of the sound? According to Saussure, it is a concept, the concept of book. It is not a particular book, not a material thing in the world. It is not even the collection of all the books in the world. What is signified is an abstract idea or concept. So the signs of language, according to the Saussure, are combinations of sounds and concepts, not of sounds and things. Alright, but why is that interesting? It is interesting because the Saussure believes that traditional theories of language have put far too much emphasis, and indeed a naive emphasis, on the relation between sounds and things. As an example, we can take a famous passage from the Confessions of Saint Augustine, in which he relates how he learned language when he was a small child. Augustine writes, "When they, my parents, named some object, and accordingly moved towards something, I saw this, and I grasped that the thing was called by the sound they uttered when they meant to point it out. Their intention was shown by their bodily movements. Thus, as I heard words repeatedly used in their proper places in various sentences, I gradually learned to understand what objects they signified. And after I had trained my mouth to form these signs, I used them to express my own desires." Augustine's theory then is this: to teach someone a word, you show them the object that the word refers to and say the word out loud. You show them a bread and you say bread. That's it. Sounds simple, and at first sight it may seem to be a realistic theory of language learning. But now, let us remember that de Saussure believes that a word is not defined by a sound and a thing, but by a sound and a concept. When we keep that in mind, we can see that Augustine may have moved far too quickly from the thing, the material bread, to the concept of bread. For how do I know what concept the sound bread is supposed to signify? Does it stand for all breads? Or just for this bread in particular? Or for food in general? Or for food made of wheat? Or for things that have been baked? Or for things that I shouldn't touch because they are yours? And so on. Showing me one example or a few examples can never teach me what does and what does not belong to the concept that is signified by the sound bread. At this point, we should recall what we said in the previous lecture about phonemes. There I pointed out that hearing an example of, say, the English oo cannot teach me which sounds do and which do not belong to the oo phoneme. For that, I need to know the boundaries with all the other phonemes in the language. Now, in pretty much the same way, seeing an example of a bread cannot possibly teach me what concept is signified by the sound bread. The thing itself is not a concept, and neither does it unambiguously point to a concept. As we just saw, a bread can illustrate such diverse concepts as bread, food, and thing you shouldn't touch because it's mine. So Augustine is wrong. We can't learn a concept just by looking at things. So how do we learn concepts? De Saussure's solution is perhaps no surprise. He believes we learn concepts by learning about the relations between all the concepts in our language. You only know what bread means when you know, among other things, that bread is a kind of food, that bread is made by a baker, what the difference is between bread and cake, between bread and cookies, between bread and flour, and so on and so forth. One only knows a concept in a language when one knows its relations to a lot of other concepts in that language. This means that, once again, according to the structuralist Saussure, the identity of something is defined by the place that this thing has in a bigger structure. A phoneme is only the phoneme that it is because it is surrounded by certain other phonemes. A concept is only the concept that it is because it has relations with certain other concepts. Here is a little thought experiment to make this more concrete. Suppose that Augustine's parents had only taught him the word bread. They show him bread, they say bread, and that's the only sound and the only concept that he knows. Would he then really know the concept of bread? Well, no. He can't talk about bread. He can't explain the difference between bread and anything else. In fact, he would probably use the sound bread for all kinds of things, because it's the only sound he knows. He would certainly not be able to understand the difference between breads and other kinds of things. Now, the argument that I've just given depends on a very important idea about language. It's an idea that structuralists believe in, and in fact it's an idea that the vast majority of thinkers of the last century or so believe in. The idea, namely, that thought requires language. If you don't have words about things other than breads, you can't really think about things other than breads. You can only think about things that you have words for. Or, to quote a famous saying of Wittgenstein's, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world." This conception of the relation between language and thought, which again is overwhelmingly popular among contemporary thinkers, is in direct contradiction with something that Augustine seems to presuppose. For it seems as if Augustine believes that the small child, as soon as he sees a bread, can already think about breads, and now all that he needs is to learn a sound, bread, that goes with that thought. On this conception, language is just sounds invented to accompany the thinking we already had before we had language. De Saussure, on the other hand, believes that by learning a language, you learn concepts, and that you need concepts in order to think. A direct result of this conception of language, and one that will be extremely important in some of our future lectures, is that different languages can have different concepts. If we were first thinking about trees and breads, and then learning sounds to go with those thoughts, then all languages would have the same concepts, right? They would just have different sounds for those concepts. Tree in English, boom in Dutch, arbre in French, and so on. But that is just not true according to the Saussure. When human beings created languages, they also created concepts and thoughts. And there is no reason why all languages would need to have the same concepts. On the contrary, if concepts are defined by the structure they are part of, then two languages could only have the same concepts if they had exactly identical structures. But anyone who has ever tried to translate, even between closely related languages like Dutch and German, knows that languages do not have the same structures, that many of their concepts are different. And thus, if we are structuralists, we must conclude that all of their concepts are different. The English tree and the Dutch boom will be slightly different, because they are part of differently structured languages. And sometimes the differences will be far greater, making it very complex, if not impossible, to translate a thought from one language to another. We can summarize these ideas as follows. According to the structuralist, languages have conceptual structures in which concepts have all kinds of relations with each other. The meaning of any concept is determined by its place in that structure. Now, this structure is really the structure of the language, not the structure of the world. So different languages can have very different conceptual structures. In turn, this means that translation will never be perfect, and that it will sometimes be very problematic indeed. In a later lecture, when we talk about postmodernism, we will see that this idea that languages have different structures has big implications for what we believe about truth. But that is another story.